Perfect. So welcome everybody and good morning. My name is Shauna Pelly, Capacity Building Programs Director with Fuse Social. I'm just going to start us off today with our land acknowledgement, and then I'll pass it over to our partners at the Canadian Red Cross, Sarah, who will give a bit of an introduction to what we're doing today. So, for those of us who are viewing the session today locally here in Buffalo, I would like to acknowledge that we are stationed on Treaty 8 territory, the traditional territory of the Cree, Dene, and Métis people. I am thankful for these borrowed lands, along with the traditional teachings and lessons of resilience that they offer us in maintaining good spirit and relations for future generations. And I'd like to pass it on over to you, Sarah.
Great. Thanks so much, Shauna. So welcome, everyone. This is the fifth in our and final speaker in our series in disaster risk reduction. And I'm so excited to be able to introduce to you Dr. Amy Christianson. But before we get started with that, I just wanted to let you know that although this is the final speaker series, it's not the last activity in this project of disaster risk reduction in the social profit sector. So I just wanted to highlight that if you're in Fort McMurray and you are part of a social profit or a small community-based organization, in April, we have two in-person workshops that are focused on service continuity planning development. So we will post a link in the chat as we go, so you can check that out. But please, hopefully you can join us for one of those two sessions. So the first one will be on April 7th in the morning, and it's a morning workshop. The second one will be on April 20th. So there'll be more details coming out about that, but I just wanted to let you know that though our speaker series is concluding, our project work is not. So we're yeah, just a few more activities under this project to come. And that said, just about the format of today's talk. So we are not in a webinar setup, as you can see. So we just ask that you keep ensure that you're on mute throughout the discussion so that we don't get any background noise or anything like that. And I'll let Amy discuss how she wants to manage questions and things like that. But both Shauna and myself will be on hand to help monitor any chat questions or any comments that might come up, and we'll make sure that Amy is aware of them. And without further ado, I would like to now introduce our speaker today. So Dr. Amy Cardinal Christianson is a Métis woman from Treaty 8 territory, currently living in Treaty 6, Central Alberta, Canada. She's a fire research scientist with the Canadian Forest Service, Natural Resources Canada. Her research explores Indigenous fire stewardship, Indigenous wildland firefighters, wildfire evacuations, and Indigenous research methodology. Amy also co-hosts the Good Fire podcast, which looks at Indigenous fire use around the world. She recently co-authored the book First Nations Wildfire Evacuations, a guide for communities and external agencies with Dr. Tara McGee, and Blazing the Trail, celebrating Indigenous fire stewardship with Indigenous colleagues. So yeah, I've been a big fan of Amy's, really appreciating both her research outputs and also the, you know, just the awareness and education content that she's producing, particularly in that podcast that we talked about. So I'm just really thrilled to turn it over and really excited about this discussion. And welcome, and thank you so much for spending some time with us this morning. Amy, and I turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and thanks, Shauna, as well, for having me here today. So I can't see anybody for some reason anymore. I just see my screen. I'm not sure. So maybe if you could just alert me verbally if there's like a chat or anybody has a question or there's an issue.
You bet. Yeah, I'll make sure we keep an eye on that.
Amy. I'm a research scientist at the Canadian Forest Service, but probably more importantly for me, I'm Métis, actually, from Treaty 8. So I'm from actually my family's from both the Labicans settlement, so which is now Duhamel in central Alberta, and then also from Owl River near Lac La Biche is where the Cardinal side of my family is from. And then they ended up in Fort McMurray and lived there, I think from about the late 1800s until, well, I still have family that's living up in that area. And so this is my family here. So my grandmother is Florence on the left there, Florence Labacan, and then Lawrence or Larry Labacan, Alvina Stratsburg, and Lucille Labacan there. So I'm not sure if anybody here, my family was pretty involved in Fort McMurray and the Métis community. So, okay, I thought at first I'd just talk about the risk from wildfire that we're seeing in Canada. So at the Canadian Forest Service, we have a wildland fire evacuation database that tracks evacuations from 1980 to 2021. So you can see here that I've kind of put in black kind of the big evacuation events. So these are evacuation orders that have occurred in Canada. So we don't track evacuation alerts, just orders where people had to leave. So 1989 was northern Manitoba, and that was kind of the largest evacuation we saw at the time, which was mostly of Indigenous communities. 2003 was Kelowna and Barrier fires. 2011 is Slave Lake. 2015 was northern Saskatchewan. 2016 was the Fort McMurray evacuation. And what you're seeing here is just the order. So there was only one order given for Fort Mac. So that's why it doesn't look like there was many evacuations that year, even though there was, that was our highest year of evacuees total. 2017 and 2018 were the BC interior fires. And then really in 2021, it was just off the charts for us in Canada in terms of wildfire evacuations. We saw 217 events in Canada. And that year, it was actually not just one province, which is what we've seen in the past. There was actually multiple provinces that were impacted by multiple evacuations. And so here is looking at the wildfire evacuees. So these are people who were evacuated. So that Manitoba one in 1989 of the smaller northern Indigenous communities, 2003 was the kind of first urban evacuation we saw of Kelowna. 2011 was Slave Lake. 2015 was again northern Saskatchewan, so Indigenous communities again and smaller population. And then 2016 was that huge evacuation of the city of Fort McMurray and surrounding areas. 2017 and 2018 were BC, and then 2021, even though we had 217 orders that year, it was actually only our third highest number of evacuees because it was mostly smaller remote or smaller rural communities that were impacted last year. So if we plot these on a map, so all the dots there are evacuation orders that have occurred. Yellow are non-Indigenous communities, orange are evacuations of Indigenous communities, and the bigger the dot is the higher number of evacuees. So the biggest dot is more than 10,000. So I think what's interesting for people to see from this map is really it's all across Canada that we're seeing wildfire evacuations, you know, from the Yukon all the way into the Maritimes. But we really see a lot of evacuations, especially of Indigenous communities in the boreal forest, as well as in the interior of BC. Those are kind of the most common areas. So on this map, it might look the same, but this is looking at how many times communities have been evacuated in that 41-year period. So what we really wanted to show here is that Indigenous communities, especially in the boreal, are frequently evacuated from wildfire. So, I mean, even in the last 3 years, Pikangikum, for example, in northwestern Ontario has been evacuated 3 times. Little Grand Rapids in Manitoba has been evacuated 2 times. And both times were for months on end. So again here, just wanted to show the disproportionate impact of wildland fire evacuations on Indigenous people. So about 5% of the Canadian population identifies as Indigenous, but many, like there's a lot of urban Indigenous people, so there are far fewer that are actually in communities that are experiencing wildfire. Yet 42% of wildfire evacuations in Canada are of communities with greater than 50% Indigenous population. So, we shouldn't be seeing that many Indigenous people evacuated if it was proportional, but really these communities are just experiencing disaster over and over again with having to leave. Again, another interesting thing from the database that I wanted to point out was the cause of the evacuation. So there's many reasons why communities are evacuated from wildfire. One can be direct fire threat, which we saw in Fort McMurray, where a fire was burning into the community. There's also smoke only evacuations where communities are evacuated because they just get smoked out. The air is just kind of too hazardous. People can't see and start panicking. And then other would be things like access. So, if a highway is getting burned over and there's only one access to the community. We saw this last year, quite a few power line evacuations where power lines were burned. So communities had to be evacuated because they had no power. So looking at Canada, 78% of evacuations are because of that direct threat of fire, and 17% are smoke. But when we're looking at communities with greater than 50% Indigenous population, only 60% are from that direct threat, like the worry that a fire will come into the community, whereas 36% are actually smoke only evacuations. So there's really no threat to to being burned or having a home burn, but it's just that the air quality is so bad that people have to leave. So as Sarah mentioned, we have a book out called First Nations Wildfire Evacuations, a guide for communities and external agencies. And this really looks at evacuation experiences across Canada of First Nations people who've been evacuated. And I think the interesting thing that the book and the research did was really, instead of talking to agency or other folk, we went to communities and talked to First Nations people who'd been evacuated. And so we spoke to over 200 evacuees and really tried to look at, issues that happen, but then also, positives or things that the communities did well. And so here, I want to point out too, when we talk about Indigenous communities, we often hear vulnerability really thrown in, oh, these communities are vulnerable to fire. But I really want to point out that Indigenous communities in Canada are vulnerable to wildfire because of colonization. So, the fact that where communities were placed in areas that are of high risk to wildfire through the reserve system. Also, we see a chronic underfunding of communities. There's many other issues at play that cause additional vulnerability. So then when you stack a wildfire event on top of it, it just really adds to the community's trauma. Another thing that really came up in the book was jurisdiction. So as you know, Indigenous communities are under federal jurisdiction, or sorry, I should say First Nations are under federal jurisdiction, but emergency management and wildfire under provincial jurisdiction. And so it makes it really confusing when trying to respond to an emergency event. And so this is one thing that repeatedly came up in the book. It seemed like when people were, like the nations themselves were dealing with the evacuations, things were actually going pretty well because they knew how to respond, what the community's needs were. But oftentimes when the complications started was when external agencies got involved, like when people ended up in evacuation centers or other places, that was really when issues happened. Excuse me. Many of the communities also had quite low levels of preparedness. And again, I want to say that's not the nation's fault. That's because of this chronic underfunding that we see. So, when communities are really struggling with their funding allotment just to meet kind of basic community needs, lots of times emergency management is put on the back burner. And so when these disasters do strike, many of the communities don't have that preparedness there that other communities that might have a full-time emergency manager might have. There's also a massive lack of trust in agencies, and I mean for good reasons. And so that's one really difficult thing when you're telling communities to evacuate, to leave, to go to an evacuation center. And we heard from some people, that it was really like being back in like the residential school system or, you know, being forced on reserve by the Indian Act. So it really brought back a lot of trauma. In this study, many of the communities or 3 of the communities that we worked with were actually air evacuations. So where they have to leave the community, usually through Department of Defense aircraft. And this means that the evacuations tend to be really long. So, you know, they send community members out. It takes a long time to get everybody out, and then it's hard to get everybody back in. There's also the separation of families that occurs, and especially with these fly-in evacuations. One issue that we saw was during like they call it sometimes like a phase 1 evacuation. So where vulnerable people are asked to leave the community. But what was happening in Ontario was they were saying like, okay, well, you know, like my cookum's vulnerable or something. So she has to leave the community and one person can go with her, but everybody else has to stay behind. So that first plane might fly to Timmins, Ontario. And then the next plane that I get on with my family might fly to Ottawa. Some of the communities were split up between, you know, 8 to 12 different host communities. So it's really difficult for people to find each other, and adds to that trauma. And then the new issues on top of old issues, that's just speaking to, you know, there's issues with like housing and overcrowding, poverty in many of the communities, drug and alcohol addiction that some band members face. And then when you're compiling a wildfire evacuation on top of it, it can be really difficult. And another thing we really discuss in the book is that lots of times agencies think that evacuations and the trauma associated with that end with repatriation. So they end when people are able to return to their community. But I mean, you guys know the best in Fort Mac that that's not the case. Like the effects from evacuation or from wildfire event linger for years after. And for this book, we talked to people who were evacuated 5 years earlier, who were still just dealing with constant trauma and PTSD from both the wildfire, but also just from what had happened to them during their evacuation. So this is all negative at the beginning, but we're going to get more happy in a minute. So anyways, there's increasing risk from wildfire. So, you know, we see on the news lots about climate change, that climate change is increasing, you know, drought, it's increasing, like how much hot weather we're experiencing in the summer, it's extending the fire season, which is all true. But on top of that, we have a lot of other factors that are influencing us in Canada and our increasing risk. So, you know, we've excluded fire from the forest in Canada through settlement, and I'll talk about that as we get going. And so we have fire suppression policies in Canada that have basically increased our fire risk by increasing the vegetation, or what we call it in fire management, the fuel loading in the forest. There's also forest management practices like cut blocks, you know, putting in roads, other things that have also impacted forests. So impacted the water that's available, impacted runoff, like we saw in British Columbia with the flooding events there. And so that's another thing that's increasing our fire risk. And as well, the expansion of the wildland urban interface. So that's basically just a fancy academic term for that people have moved into the forest, that there's infrastructure in the forest, that there's industry in the forest now where there might not have been before. And so that's creating this additional risk. So I'll maybe just stop here. I see the chat, there's 4 things. Is there anything I need to address there?
There is one question.
Okay,
Is it because Indigenous communities are more rural and have less fire suppression systems? I think as you've gone on to speak, I think maybe you've covered a few of those, but is there anything you wanted to reinforce in terms of, I think it was around the higher impact on Indigenous communities?
Sure. So that's a great question. We saw that in BC a bit this summer, where Indigenous communities were basically saying like, we want to have our own fire crews, but they're not allowed. You know, the one thing that we have with wildfire management and other disaster responses is that through the centralization of emergency management, you know, we have outside people coming into communities that are saying, you know, okay, we're the experts now, you guys get out and, you know, we'll take care of things. And so for many Indigenous communities don't trust that. And that's why lots of times we see refusal to evacuate. Another thing maybe I'll just mention on that point is that in many of these kind of big disaster events, so Kelowna or Slave Lake or Fort Mac, we focus on those urban or like more urban centers that were evacuated. But what maybe people don't know about Slave Lake especially was, Slave Lake was evacuated, but there was also 12 First Nations and Métis communities that were evacuated at the same time. And all of the focus from fire management, just because of the, the limited capacity, was on protecting the community of Slave Lake. So many of those nations felt like they were abandoned. And we talk about that in the book with the Whitefish Lake First Nation that I worked with, which is just west of Slave Lake. And so they actually left people behind in their community that did firefighting, even though they weren't supposed to because they didn't have the proper certifications, but they felt like they were the ones that saved their community from wildfire. So I'll maybe just jump here. So, I said the beginning is always negative, right? So like placing the wildfire situation, but, I think sometimes we're always trying to find new solutions, but sometimes, that there's other things that we can do. And so the next part of my presentation is mostly going to be about Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous disaster risk reduction, mostly looking at fire because I'm a fire research scientist, of course. But I mean, it's applicable to any other thing, and especially all types of climate change adaptation. So I just wanted to kind of step back to a different time and a different, a different forest than what we're seeing now. So what I work with quite a bit is Indigenous cultural burning. So this is basically a practice across Canada by different nations that has been used since time immemorial. And so the fire knowledge that Indigenous nations had, it was not singular, but it was plural and deeply connected to place. So basically, people knew in their territories how to burn to reduce wildfire risk and for cultural purposes. And Indigenous nations held significant, or I shouldn't say held, they still hold, even though they've tried to take it away from us, hold significant knowledge about fire-driven landscapes, and that fire is not just fire to our communities. So, we talk a lot about good fire, and that's the podcast that I'm involved in. So, the fire that Fort Mac experienced was a bad fire. Those are the scary fires, the high risk fires that we don't want to see on the landscape. But there's also good fire and ways, that fire can be used to help us. And many Indigenous people feel that fire was a gift from the Creator, that fire has a spirit and is here to help us. And so on the right there, those are my two daughters, and they're watching the start of a burn in our territory where we're living now in Treaty 6. And so it's neat for me because my family were actually co-signers onto Treaty 6, and weren't allowed to participate in their cultural practices. So for me to bring something like this back to the territory, even though we're not exactly where my family was settled, is really exciting for me. So a good way to describe it is that Indigenous people sought to replace fires of chance with fires of choice. So putting fire on the landscape at the appropriate time, in the appropriate conditions, in the right area, instead of, just having a lightning strike during like the hottest day of summer, start a massive out of control crown fire. That's not what we want to see with Indigenous fire. And one thing you hear when you visit communities is often this idea of cleaning the land, so using fire almost like a maintenance thing and to achieve certain cultural objectives. So on the picture there, on the bottom right, that's Cumberland House Métis community. And there they burn and use fire in the winter actually to improve muskrat habitat. So there used to be, hundreds of thousands of muskrats in that area. But since the dam came in on the Saskatchewan River Delta there, they really lost a lot of their muskrat population, and especially because of overgrowth of vegetation. So there's a group of a Métis firekeeper there, Solomon Carrier, and then he's teaching basically Métis youth on how to use fire to bring back muskrat and create that kind of more healthy environment. And so a quote from a person who worked with Indigenous elders in Northern Canada who burned, one of the elders said, "I didn't set the forest on fire just for the sake of burning, but so that I could return to hunt the next year and live." And so I just want to add too that, fire, there's always a risk with fire, and Indigenous people knew that very well. If you were living in a certain territory and you burned at the wrong time under the improper conditions, you could start a fire that burned your entire territory, which would make it very difficult for you to live there, obviously, for the next 20, 30 years. Whereas the fires that, Indigenous nations were trying to set, the idea was to produce a garden or to produce a forest or an orchard, around their communities so that they didn't have to travel as far to get resources. And up there is a link to the Good Fire podcast if anyone's interested. That's where myself and my co-host Matt talk to all sorts of different international Indigenous fire keepers about fire and how they're currently using it, how they used it in the past, and what they see for the future. And I should just add on the left, this is kind of a famous, I think it's the Blackfoot Nation starting a prairie fire. And so they used fire quite often on the prairie. And one of the big things was that, you burn off that kind of dead, dry grass, and then you get really nice, healthy green grass coming up. And it basically attracts then deer or moose or bison, buffalo, other things to the area. So it can make hunting a lot easier for communities that depend on subsistence living. So I just wanted to talk about the boreal forest, because lots of times when I present on this, people say like, oh, well, sure, maybe some nations did that, like in BC or something, but we didn't do that in the boreal forest. And unfortunately, because of colonization, and I'm going to talk about that in a bit, but we've lost a bunch of knowledge that we had about burning. But tree ring studies and charcoal studies and other things that fire researchers use are really showing us that fire was actually extensively used across the boreal forest pre-settlement. And so I really want to stress this idea of, that there really is no wilderness. The boreal forest is not wild. It's not really our concept of natural, but instead it's a cultural landscape. So, it's a landscape that people use frequently to promote or to sustain their culture. And so in actually the area right where you guys are, northeastern Alberta, the most extensive research program about cultural burning was conducted by Henry Lewis and Teresa Ferguson in the 1970s. So they looked at fire use by the Dene and Woodland Cree in northern Alberta. And on the left is the Time for Burning publication by Henry Lewis. And so this is kind of really one of the seminal documents. So the most important documents on cultural fire, in Canada and both internationally, where they talk to elders from all over about, how they burned, why they burned. And so some of the reasons for burning, this is a huge list, but maintenance of meadows, opening grasslands, burning deadwood, extending the growing season, obtaining firewood, improving settlements and campsite areas, making and maintaining trails, opening up animal habitat, increasing berry production, reducing pests, religious reasons, and aesthetic benefits. And so Indigenous peoples that they spoke to were highly knowledgeable about fire. So about the seasonality, the timing of burning, the fuel conditions necessary, the relative humidity that was needed, the general wind in the area, other general weather conditions, the slope steepness, and natural fire breaks as they relate to burning. And so especially up in your area, lots of the fire and burning was done around the snow. So, when snow was either going to come or when the snow was leaving, because snow basically acts as a natural fire break. So lots of times meadows were burned or kept open in the summer, or sorry, not in the summer, in the spring. So as the snow melted out of the meadow, but still remained like in the trees, they would go and burn there because, the second the fire kind of creeped along and hit the snow, it would just naturally go out. And another really neat thing that I learned from reading Dr. Lewis's work from elders there was that they would also burn to extend the growing season in the north. So, when you've got that kind of dry grass and like it's kind of browny and stuff in the spring and crunchy, they would go in and burn that, and it would basically turn the ground black, right? And so what does black do? It absorbs heat from the sun and really kind of melts out the frost out of the ground. So you get earlier grass growth. And it's funny because I've seen, the recent studies by fire researchers on this and saying like, oh, when areas are burned, you get more grass production. Okay, well, Indigenous people have known that for millennia in the north, but it's something that we aren't allowed to use as often. So Indigenous knowledge systems, not only with fire, but they really steward biodiversity. There's been numerous studies that have come out that show how Indigenous knowledge can increase biodiversity in areas. And the most recent one was that, even though Indigenous communities hold very little of the land, they're responsible for 80% of the biodiversity in the world. And so that, there's something right that Indigenous communities are doing. And lots of that is this focus on more of a holistic style of land management instead of, just individual species are concerned. And also Indigenous knowledge really offers nature-based solutions to climate change. So when we look, for example, at cultural fire emits a lot less carbon than an out-of-control crown fire. And so in Australia and other places, there's actually communities that are burning through carbon offset programs. So they're calculating how much carbon that they're saving from going into the atmosphere based on their type of fire compared to an out of control wildfire. And then they get money for that through these carbon offset programs. So how does this relate to Indigenous disaster risk reduction? So this kind of gained popularity through the Sendai framework and the United Nations Center for Disaster Risk Reduction. But Indigenous disaster risk reduction has always been around. It's just, that communities, especially in colonized nations, are not really allowed to use their knowledge anymore. So Indigenous peoples are the most likely to suffer the most severe consequences from disaster. So the stats that I showed you earlier on wildfire, but are often excluded from risk management. So for Indigenous communities, for example, in Canada and with fire, even though they're the most impacted, there's very few Indigenous people in Canada in high decision-making positions around fire management. And so Indigenous knowledge systems play a vital role in reducing wildfire risk. And so I really in reducing any risk, but we're going to talk about wildfire. So I really like this publication by my colleague, Dr. Lambert. He's out of Saskatchewan, but he's actually Maori from New Zealand, or from Aotearoa, I guess New Zealand, as some people know it. So he feels that essential disaster risk reduction strategies can be adapted for Indigenous communities. And so these are kind of some of the tips that he gives. So through respect for Indigenous approaches and coordinating alliances, through culturally appropriate incentives, from accurate, appropriate, and ethical data collection, from acknowledgement of Indigenous land use practices, use of Indigenous language, leadership, and institutions in disaster risk reduction, collaboration with Indigenous knowledges, which of course is incredibly important, and acceptance of traditional healing approaches. So again, I see a few comments there. This might be a good spot just to pause for a second if there's a question or anything.
There was one, people are interested in where they can find the book. I posted the UBC Press, but is there anywhere more local perhaps that you know about?
Yeah, so actually what I'll do is when I'm done, there's actually the Time for Burning book was actually adapted as a film. So there's it's on YouTube. Somebody stuck it up. One of my colleagues stuck it up there. So I'll put it in the chat for you guys to watch. Just a warning, I don't know for cultural sensitivities, but obviously there are people in the film who are deceased. But it's a really interesting look. I mean, they go and film people who were burning in the Fort Mac and more northern areas. But the thing that makes me sad about it is even that when they were doing that work in the 1970s, one of Dr. Lewis's comments was that he felt like already then in the 1970s that 95% of the knowledge around burning in the communities had been lost through colonization. And so, you know, it makes me think like 50 years later, where are we? But in that same sense, the elders and other people that I'm privileged enough to speak with across Canada have such vast knowledge of fire. It's incredible. And so I can't even imagine, you know, where things would have been, you know, if we hadn't experienced kind of this colonization, which anyways, I'm going to get into next.
Also, I think people are interested in the fire evacuation with Tara McGee publication. Is that widely available in bookstores, or do we have to go online for that?
The book, the First Nations Wildfire Evacuation book.
Yeah.
So it's I think you can get it on the UBC Press. I think somebody sent me a picture of it in Chapters or like Indigo, or you can get it on Amazon, of course, if you want to support them. So and so I think I'm trying to think though where else. I'm not really sure. I mean, one thing that we could provide you guys with up there is copies. If you'd like that, we can send some up, but maybe we can talk about that later.
Sure, thanks. And Guy Choquette has asked, do you know the history of your last name?
Of Cardinal or my married Viking name, or the Cardinal Abacan?
I'm not sure. Guy, did you want to unmute and ask? Maybe he's anyway, maybe we can hold this question to the end.
Sorry, I thought I was unmuting.
Oh,
no, I was going
go.
to say, your last name, Laboucan, means smoke in French. So I feel like it's an appropriate name for the profession you're in. So I don't know if you have any insight into that, but I found that interesting.
Yeah, I think the name was actually La Fournaise, which was basically given to the family, I think, by some French people. And I think, doesn't that mean like the furnace or the chimney in French? There was something about that.
Fournaise is furnace, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyways, but yeah, so it's an interesting name because it was kind of given through colonization, but yeah, it's still, like you said, seems pretty appropriate for the work that I'm doing.
Thank you.
Yeah, no worries.
That's great.
Okay.
And that was the end of the questions so far.
Okay, perfect. So, okay, I just wanted to get a bit into the cultural severance. So many people talk like, okay, well, Indigenous disaster risk reduction or cultural burning, other things like, why aren't we doing this? And I mean, I think we have to realize that for many Indigenous nations across Canada and in other colonized countries went through this massive cultural severance. So as settlers came across Canada, basically Indigenous people were told that the practices that they were doing, you know, weren't appropriate for the land that they were on. And so when settlers came, especially with fire, you know, they were used to seeing fire from a European context, and they didn't understand fire, especially in the boreal forest or other places. And so there was a lot of fear associated with it, and a big worry about timber and timber supplies, without them actually realizing that, you know, fire was actually what was sustaining the healthy forest and the timber that they were seeing, in the good way, I should say, not the bad fires that we're seeing now. So with European settlement, it really brought with it fire exclusion and suppression. So basically the Europeans wanted to exclude fire or remove fire from the ecosystems in Canada, not knowing how important or vital it was. And then they formed fire suppression, or, you know, fire response agencies that would basically go and put fires out. And they were pretty successful, actually, for about 30 or 40 years at reducing fires in Canada. But we're really seeing the consequences of that now, along with, you know, when it combines with climate change, it's not a good situation. So there's a really good study out by Dr. Vignetta out of the University of Oregon, where she talks about how wildfire management agencies racialize like cultural burning and delegitimized or erased Indigenous peoples and knowledge through 3 key narratives as they colonized. Well, this is for the US, but I mean, it applies to Canada because it's a very similar history. So there was a lot of discrediting of Indigenous knowledge. So that whole idea of the savage narrative, you know, that Indigenous people were savages and didn't have the extensive knowledge and education that European people had. There was also downplaying. So this whole idea of the vanishing Indian narrative. So, you know, oh, well, you know, we don't there's only a small amounts of Indigenous people. There's no way that they could have been, you know, managing vast ecosystems. And, you know, there's hardly any, you know, Indians around anyways. And then erasure. So that whole idea of the terra nullius narrative, where, you know, when Europeans came over, it was empty land that they were discovering that wasn't managed, that whole idea of wilderness. And so they really saw that Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous peoples had no place in that kind of new world. So this one I just wanted to talk about. So this is basically showing 3 different scenarios. So the first one is a landscape that has cultural fire and has natural lightning fire on it. And you can see all the different, it's basically produced what we call a mosaic forest. So where you're not, you know, sometimes when you go to the mountains and like you stand at those viewpoints and look over the forest, and you just kind of see this blanket of coniferous or like spruce and pine and fir trees. And lots of people think that that's beautiful, but that's really not the healthy state of the forest. These patchwork forests or mosaic forests of like differing succession, so different ages of the forest, are really what makes forests resilient, not only to wildfire, but also to pests and other disturbances that might happen. As well, for biodiversity, it's really important because you have a vast number of different types of you know, smaller ecosystems in a small area. So you can have all different types of biodiversity. So that's what the top one is showing there. And then on that landscape, when you do get a lightning fire, like the fire might burn for a ways, but then it will hit kind of one of these patches of, you know, earlier succession forest, so like an aspen forest or a meadow, and go out sometimes, or, you know, it won't be that kind of intense fire activity that we're seeing where, you know, it's just crown fires that are raging for kilometers and kilometers. So in these mosaic forests, the fire can never really build up, basically, to, you know, those firestorms that we're seeing where it's producing its own weather. And so the middle one is what happened with fire suppression campaigns. So, you know, we would start to see, you know, that there's you can see a little plane there and like a parachute, I can't remember the whatever, firefighter coming in. And basically the idea was, you know, any little fire starts like that, you put them out right away. So that whole 10 o'clock rule, you know, that we want fires out by 10 o'clock in the morning or actioned. Oh no, sorry, this should be a video, but for some reason but I'll just leave it for that. Okay. And then on the bottom, we're seeing really the consequences of that, the type of management system where we're seeing fire suppression combined with forest management techniques combined with climate change, where instead now we're having these massive fires growing on the forest that really are difficult to suppress and put out. And so people might say, oh, that's yeah, sounds great, Amy, but like, you know, that's probably not true. But we can see this all over Canada when we're looking at historic photos. So this is an example in BC looking at Monty Lake. So on the top picture there, you can see looking out that it's, you know, you can really see the patchiness through the forest canopy. You can see the forest floor in many places. You can see a lot of different meadows. The middle picture is then through fire suppression, just that kind of blanket coniferous forest that I talked about, where you're just getting, you know, you can't see the forest floor anymore. Lots of the meadows and that patchiness or mosaic is totally gone. And then in the very bottom is a big fire that went through there. just before 2015. And so it's really showing that the forest wants to return to that kind of initial state that we were seeing in 1930. With the, it's trying to put back in the patchiness itself on the landscape. But unfortunately, now there's communities there, people who are being impacted by these big fire events. So for Indigenous people that I'm speaking with across Canada, what we really, I think, want is this reunion with fire. So where Indigenous people are kind of back in decision-making and leadership positions about what's happening on our landscape. So this whole idea of Indigenous disaster risk reduction, using Indigenous knowledge that's been developed over millennia to be able to put into place around our communities on the landscape to basically reduce the risk. And so on the right is a Cree Métis artist named Karen Erickson, whose art I just love. You can follow her on Facebook, but she did this picture for a book that I'm going to talk about soon, and really looking at, what fire means to her communities. So, it's so important for ceremony and other aspects as well. And, the production of medicinal plants, strawberries, things that we see and that we need on the landscape to sustain our cultures. And fish too. Lots of people don't realize the importance of fire and fish. But especially in BC and other places, there's a real connection there. So I was just going to show a video here, but you'll just have to let me know if it works, the sound. Like normally it works when I'm in presentation mode, but because I'm not, so just let me know if you don't hear any sound, and then we can just skip it. Can you hear like water running?
Yes, it's working.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Bridge River and the Bridge River Valley. They call that in our language, land of plenty. Grandfather and my dad said, watch, learn, remember, The old timers would say, okay, we'll go up to Darcy, that's almost dry enough to burn. And then the old timers would get prepared and put the fire guard around, like the houses and stuff. And then they'd burn up to the snow line. The snow line would be their fire guard. So, and the brush in them days never got as thick as it did now, especially in the gullies like the Maple and all those. Like some of those gullies now is high as this building, that's going to be 2,000-3,000 degrees heat, you burn that. It's because in them days it didn't grow that thick, because every 10 or 15 years they say, okay, it's starting to overgrow, and then they'd burn it again.
As time goes by and people aren't educated and versed in the benefits of fire and why we really need it and all that, that slowly got lost, and the expertise got lost to do the prescribed burning. And so, yeah, you compound all that and it almost went away, right? So I know my whole career, I've been passionate about the use of prescribed fire and all the good reasons for it. When you hear the word ecosystem restoration, it's simply an objective, and how to achieve it through prescribed fire.
See all that invasive weeds, all that knapweed and dodderweed and by the roadsides, and they're just clumps of almost like tissue paper just waiting for a match.
Talking to the elders and gaining their knowledge and what they want to see and why they did things the way they were, that all forms that prescription part prior to the burn plan.
A fire that's not prescribed right, it's going to wreck it instead of fix it. When fire goes through and you come back a couple of weeks later or something, then you see those little green stems coming up. You got it right properly. But if it burns down towards the roots, kills it, then you got to wait 5-6 years for that to grow.
Where the deer come down and graze in winter. And they weren't getting much food. So Pop Ullman must have got them to go and start a fire below and burnt the hillside. You can still see where that fire went, just up so far. And next spring that grass grew high, and nice and green. So the deer had food through the winter because it was the grass grew over the snow, and that's what the deer ate in the winter. And that was a good burn.
There's a lot of learning to be done on BC Wildfire's part too, right? Because for years they've been trained to put fire out, right? They haven't been taught how to apply fire to meet objectives.
We're trying to prevent wildfire from coming into our reserve as well as protecting the surrounding area. So if a fire does come through here, it's going to stop at a certain point and just hit the ground level and put itself out at the bottom. It's actually an honor to be working on my own reserve, to come back home and do the work around here, letting the elders look upon us and then being role models for the kids as well.
The project that we're involved in right now, like the community is getting more involved. Actually, they are more aware of the burns that we're doing now, and it opens up people's eyes for that it should be done, and the management that has to be done for it, because there's so much fuel loading now too nowadays. And I'm glad that our band is actually one of the bands that like to burn and will burn on their land. Not too many bands do that nowadays, actually. So we're trying to push forward so that with involving finesse, that they'll help bring other communities to realize what they can do.
Okay, that's actually the end there. Like, it just goes into the credit. So that's a project that we're doing in in BC that I'm working on with different nations. And so the whole idea about it is revitalizing traditional or cultural burning activities. So where we're integrating Indigenous cultural values into wildfire management and climate adaptation planning. So this is, yeah, I don't expect you to see this infographic. It's very tiny. It's supposed to be huge. But what it basically means is, you know, you can't just go now and do a burn. Like, I don't want anyone going around Fort Mac and, you know, just saying, oh, fire's good and starting a fire, right? The landscape that we see now is not the landscape that we had 100 years ago. So it's really important to work with elders and other fire knowledge holders to be able to know how to appropriately use fire at the right time. It really is, you know, although these people don't hold PhDs, they are absolute experts in what they do and how they know how to use fire. And so that's the idea of this project, is really going and working with those elders and knowledge holders, learning about fire, where communities burned and their nation burned, and then, you know, going back and trying to put that fire back on the landscape in safe and healthy ways for the community. But it's really meaningful for the elders. It's just amazing. Going and seeing, like, one of the elders was in that video, you know, he told me, like, when you go and do that first burn, like, I want to be out there to see, you know, how, like, to be there as we bring fire back to the landscape that my grandpa used to burn on. Like, he was super emotional about it. So it's really, like I said, for Indigenous people, it's not just about fire or, like, you know, any kind of pyromania. It's about culture, you know, and sustaining our nations. So one thing that I've really heard across Canada is that, you know, there's many local nations that are making, like, really good strides in this, but they keep coming up just against constant roadblocks. There's so many barriers in place that are put in by these kind of colonial management systems. And so one thing was to kind of form some sort of national Indigenous coalition or something on fire, where you could get, you know, experts together and, you know, not telling individual communities what to do, but really working as an advocacy and almost kind of lobbying group for these wildfire management agencies to be able to get fire back and to start to change, like, these high level policies. And so the first step in getting this done was in engagement sessions with 46 Indigenous fire experts from across Canada, where we looked at simple things like, do we need a national group? What should the national group do? Where should it be housed? Who should be on it? And so Indigenous consultancy company prepared this report for us with recommendations. And so the next step is actually to form a steering committee to start to guide this group. There's also an Indigenous Use of Fire committee that started nationally through the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership. And really the purpose of this committee is to transform wildland fire management in protected areas in Canada. So in parks, but also in Indigenous protected conservation areas, to be more inclusive of Indigenous approaches, involvement, and leadership in fire management. So there's different Indigenous people who sit on that group and Indigenous elders who also guide that group. And again, that's a higher level group, really looking, you know, how can we help, or I shouldn't say help, I hate that word. How can we support, you know, communities to get back on the ground? And one of the really exciting initiatives that I think that's coming is the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, their work on the Guardian program. So I don't know if you guys have heard, but there's 70 Guardian programs nationally that are where Indigenous Guardians are involved on their nations in environmental monitoring. But really what the group wants to get into is rekindling their relationship with fire. So having First Nation fire guardians who are in wildfire management and response. And so looking at, you know, their first step here is that they've just drafted a national strategy on how to get Indigenous guardians involved in fire. And so that's not only from, you know, a fire suppression or fire crews, but also looking at how the Indigenous disaster risk reduction aspect, how to get fire and other Indigenous ideas about how to reduce risk back on the landscape. So usually too, when I present this, people are like saying to me, oh, well, why aren't we doing this already? Well, there are so many issues around trying to get fire back on the landscape, and there's such low recognition of Indigenous expertise related to fire. We have 30 and 40-year, Indigenous firefighters out on the fire line who know how to do cultural burning, who aren't allowed basically to carry out that knowledge because they don't have a high school diploma. So they don't fit into like the wildfire agency, their employment conditions basically to be able to kind of ascend, I guess, into higher level positions. There's also massive power dynamics. So Indigenous peoples, like, can you on reserve, it's easier to burn, but if you want to burn in your territory, like the Crown land surrounding, it's incredibly difficult. And I think that part of that is because of these bigger issues. Like if they allow Indigenous people to burn on their territory, that's basically admitting that that's their territory. So it gets to Indigenous sovereignty and land back issues, which many government agencies don't want to touch. There's also massive amounts of money that we spend on fly-in experts. So, in fire suppression, we always see like the South African, the Australian, and other crews coming in. And, they're coming into kind of a landscape that Indigenous people know as their local area, but to them it's foreign. And, they don't have a good understanding of fire and how fire operates on that landscape. There's also no sustained funding really for jobs for Indigenous peoples in this area, and that includes emergency management. I think the Guardians program is a start, but usually what's happening is we're just getting kind of these one-off projects. So even that Bridge River video I showed, like we got money there to do that one burn that was filmed. And I mean, that's not going to make a difference really for the community. We need a lot more good fire on the landscape. And we need a lot more Indigenous people involved year round in emergency management. And many communities too face really overwhelming requests. So, they're just constantly getting peppered with different government agencies that want them to be involved in different projects and different, corporations and other things. And everybody, that's asking them to do these things is, in a paid full-time position usually. But many of the Indigenous peoples that they're approaching are not. And so, we wouldn't expect, like firefighters to kind of work, without getting paid for a long period of time. But we seem to expect that Indigenous communities or peoples will be involved as volunteers, where it's just really not appropriate to ask them to do that. And so for me, in the end, it really comes down to kind of a social justice issue about, this removal of Indigenous knowledge from emergency management and fire in Canada, and trying to get it back to kind of reclaim, our territories and what has been lost. And so this is the last slide. So just to wrap, I wanted to just point out to everybody the Blazing the Trail booklet. It was produced by Fire Smart Canada, but it was actually written by 10 different Indigenous fire knowledge holders from across Canada. It was peer reviewed by other Indigenous peoples. It was graphic designed by an Indigenous person. It has Indigenous artwork throughout from people that were pretty well compensated to have their artwork featured. And it has stories of 11 different nations across Canada that are trying to basically reduce fire risk to their communities. And it's really a celebration of Indigenous fire stewardship in Canada. And so you can get that on the Fire Smart Canada website. It's $10, but if you contact them, there's an email there. If you're an Indigenous, you can get a copy for free. They'll mail one out to you. And if you have any issues, just contact me and I'll make sure that you get one. So yeah, that's the last slide there. So I'll just stop sharing so I can actually see something here and see the chat.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Amy. That was super informative. I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions, and we'll just give everyone a minute to reflect. I noticed a small discussion starting after what's happened in British Columbia. I was wondering, which is really encouraging, but how can we sustain that momentum? And like, am I right in noticing that like cultural burning is starting to come up? And it's also like really connected to issues of reconciliation and things like that. So just wondering about your observations about what particularly in British Columbia has kind of sparked the discussion, and how can we sustain that?
Sure. So I think, as society seem to face these kind of fire or flood or other overwhelming, issues, I think people start to realize that the current management systems aren't working. So what's something different that we can do? And that's usually, in Australia and California, that's usually when people turn to Indigenous knowledge. And that's really what I think we're seeing in British Columbia, is that, they've pretty much for the last 5 years been smoked out or evacuated for 3 of the years. And so people there are frustrated. And it's like, what can we do that's different? And I think that's where this idea of Indigenous fire has really come in. But there's I don't know, I'm probably just a worrier. I mean, I'm in risk for a living. So I always worry about appropriation of knowledge. And so there's, agencies, for example, who want to take cultural burning or Indigenous knowledge and like either integrate it or gather it or put it in their own agencies. But the important thing about Indigenous knowledge is that it has to be with Indigenous peoples, like with the culture that sustains it. And so, it's more to me about not that idea of integrating or incorporating, but supporting Indigenous nations to be able to participate and to use their own knowledge. So rather than, paying an elder to teach you about how to burn, and then you go out and do it through your agency, it would instead be you supporting that elder in their communities, so that they can go out and use fire how they want on the landscape. But we're still really seeing kind of that paternalistic approach to it. I'm hoping like there's a bunch of people working in the background trying to ensure that doesn't happen. But yeah, it's always for me a worry, that kind of, stealing of knowledge.
So we do have time for questions. You can either submit them in the chat and we can read them out, or if you wanted to raise your hand, I knew, Guy, I turn it over to you. I figured you might have something to say.
No, thank you, Amy. It's just, I really appreciate the difference between helping and supporting, like, because that's what you just described. But I learned a new term today, cultural severance. I'd never heard that before. So, and it's interesting. It's on I don't know, some social media or something. I saw last week cultural burning happening in Australia with the communities there as well. So it just kind of makes you appreciate that. And the only other thing I know is like the boreal forest, I think it's the second largest source of clean air in the world. It's such a valuable resource. And I think with the climate change and getting warmer, the bogs that in the boreal, if they melt, they release all of this carbon in the air, right? So it's not just about, it's about the holistic health of the globe, right? So I really appreciate, and it really surprised me too, that the number of evacuations are higher in boreal forest, because in my mind, boreal is like moist, right? But it's not necessarily the case. So anyways, thank you for sharing your knowledge.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, when fires get rolling through the boreal, it's pretty scary. I mean, you guys know that firsthand in Fort Mac. I don't know why I'm telling you that, but yeah, I think though one of my real concerns too is because we've changed the forest so much that some of my colleagues who are, physical science fire researchers, what they're finding is that when these big crown fires go through, that the forest doesn't recover. Like it's actually turning areas into dunes. And because the fires are so hot and intense that they're burning the soil. So all the peat, all the soil. And, for Indigenous peoples, the reason why we can exist in these areas is because of the forest and, our relationship to it. So when you completely remove the forest through these devastating fires, you can't, it severs your cultural tie. And so my colleague Faisal Mullah actually taught me that term. And I think it's such a good one because it really talks like when colonization came, like, people were out burning their land and suddenly they were told, you can't burn. That's a stupid thing to do. You don't know what you're doing. Put your kids in residential school, get on your reserve and shut up, right? So it was really like, I think sever is a really good way to describe what happened to people and their knowledge.
That's terrific. So we do have a couple of hands up. The first one I saw was Cheryl. Over to you, Cheryl.
Thank you. Just thank
Hi,
you.
Cheryl.
First. Hi, thank you so much. This has been incredible. And thank you again for Red Cross for being super and bringing these amazing things forward. So there are just so many things. I'll have to have virtual coffee with you another time if you have time. But I would love to hear the story of the fish, how the forest and the fish and the drought and the wind and in time, whenever it's appropriate, I would love to hear the connection between the forest and the fish. And maybe the other thing I was kind of curious about, I've been wondering for a while, is what is the connection between protecting lumber for private enterprise and the suppression of Indigenous knowledge? I kind of wonder about that. It seems a little like a question mark for me.
Sure, yeah. So for fish, I mean, fire is so closely tied to watershed health. And that's really what we're seeing in British Columbia, right? So when you have these proper mosaics on the landscape, basically the water can kind of filter through these landscapes as it goes through runoff. So that's one thing, but most of the research that's been done on that has actually been in more like kind of mountainous or hilly areas. So in like British Columbia, California, Oregon, where Indigenous people really burn for fish. And the one thing that they would often do is that when it was like a really kind of hot day, they would go and set like fires or burn piles or other thing to basically create a smoke layer in the valley, which would then protect the water from getting too hot, which would protect the fish spawn. So at certain times of the year. So yeah, they kind of knew about, smoke inversions and valleys and water temperature, yeah, and all of that way back. And so that's one, one of the things that they used to do. And I mean, setting fire, obviously, at those times in really safe ways, but because they had culturally burned or cleared the areas, they could do that. But yeah, Don Hankins, who's one of my colleagues at Chico State University, at Chico campus for California State University, he's the fire and fish and water guy. And actually, to promote the podcast, there's an episode on there with Don where he talks quite in depth about water and fire and all of that.
Thank you. That's
and
great.
Then, yeah, the relation to the commercial timber, I think when Indigenous or when settlers first came, they saw these fires that were happening, and many of the settler accounts that you read are like, the Indigenous people are, the savages are setting fire. They don't know what they're doing. Like, they're going to burn down all of the timber that we can basically market and sell back. But they didn't realize like the correlation between like when you're doing a cultural fire, you're trying to protect those big healthy trees, right? And remove anything that's dead or diseased. And also to kind of clear the ground from other growth coming up to really sustain that healthy forest. And so that's another thing I think that maybe people don't understand. They seem to associate fire with loss of timber, and loss of that market value. So again, kind of another more European way of thinking.
So is there actually potential to use, well, I guess what you're saying in part is that you can use the low temperature, low intensity fire to maintain these forests that are going to be planned to be used for cutting, because a low intensity fire won't bother the big trees. They'll just be like, yeah, whatever. And it'll protect that, as opposed to if it's a crown fire, they all get destroyed and oops. So it's actually a tool to protect lumber supplies. Is that a fair way to say that?
Yeah, it could be. So basically what you're trying to do is to prevent those severe disturbances by having a healthy, resilient forest. And so like on my land, like, I mean, we burn around our house, we burn up in the forest. And because of like when we're putting fire on the landscape in such a low intense way, it doesn't bother the trees. And I've been with fire keepers in BC where what they'll do is they'll rake around the big trees that they want to sustain. to kind of keep so that the fire doesn't actually even approach or, disturb the trees. But I mean, the one thing I will say that it's difficult for agencies with cultural fire is that many agencies are around prescribed fire, or what they call production burning, where it's like getting as much fire on the landscape in as little time as possible with as few resources, because, you want to basically, there's such short time periods for burning. Whereas with cultural fire, really what it needs to involve is a lot of people burning during the right time. And so in California, one of the elders said like their goal there is to burn 1 million acres every year. And so people are like, so much, but he said it's not if you have 1 million Indigenous people each burning 1 acre, right? So it's kind of about I guess like kind of taking away that centralization of fire from only that a few people can do it to, really educating more people to be able to use fire safely in a good way. Right now, we seem to kind of just ignore the problem and just say to people like, we're the experts, like, you don't know what you're doing, like, you can't burn or you need a permit, but people do it anyways. So it's almost like, we need to